The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
After he had fed the people, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and precede him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. After doing so, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves. The wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. At once Jesus spoke to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught Peter and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
The first reading today from the book of Kings about Elijah finding God in the still small voice is a very well-known and a very beloved and a very beautiful reading. It reminds us of the gentleness of God, the quiet presence of God. But in some ways, it can give us the impression that God is only to be found in quiet, or in serenity, or in peacefulness, or on a retreat, or in a quiet room in prayer. For whatever reason, God chooses not to be present to Elijah in the storm, or the earthquake, or the fire. But that doesn't mean that God's presence is necessarily excluded from the storms, or the earthquakes, or the fires of our lives. The storms of our lives, or the chaos of our lives, are places where not only can we meet God, but the places that we most need to seek God. And the gospel reminds us of that. Jesus comes to the disciples in the midst of the storm to comfort them, to help them, to calm the storm for them. Our fears in the midst of the storms of our lives, just as the disciples were afraid in their boat being tossed by the waves, our fears are nothing to be ashamed of. They're not signs of cowardice. They're real. We have them because we ourselves are not able always to negotiate the storms. Our fears in the midst of the storms of our lives are reminders to us of our humanity, of our creatureliness. The fact that on our own, we cannot walk on the waters of the problems and the storms and the crises of our life. Our fears in the times of troubles remind us of how dependent we are on the presence of God in our life, not only in times of peacefulness and serenity, but especially in times of trouble. That sinking feeling we have at those moments is a reminder to us and a grace to us that we need the hand of the Lord to walk on the water, to negotiate our lives in good times and bad, but especially when we feel ourselves sinking, when we feel ourselves being overrun by the problems, the crises, the possible losses come to us. And we remind ourselves that on our own we do sink. But if we find Jesus in the midst of the storm, we can find our way through. We can walk on the water. Not because we are strong, but because the Lord is strong. In the gospel, we're reminded of Jesus' own humanity as much as his divinity. Like Elijah, after Jesus feeds the 5,000, after he teaches, he wanted to be alone with God. He wanted to pray to the Father. I don't know what his prayer was like with the Father, but I can imagine it was not too long before this that John the Baptist was martyred. And Jesus had been working pretty hard since then. And I suspect I'm sure John's death deeply affected Jesus, not only grieving him, his cousin, but also unsettling him. It was a storm that had come into Jesus' own life and own ministry. And it had to be a reminder for him, or a reckoning for him, the human Jesus, in his understanding of where his mission from the Father could lead him. What could happen to him, what storms and chaos he might be facing in the weeks and months to come of his life as the human Jesus on his mission from the Father. And so he went up on the mountain like Elijah, and he prayed, and he spoke with the Father, and he heard the Father's voice. And I don't know what that prayer was and what the Father said to Jesus. But when he came down on the mountain, he had the courage, the human Jesus, both human, God and man, but certainly very human. The human Jesus had the courage to step out onto the sea and begin walking across the sea, because he knew the Father would hold him above the water, that he could walk on water, that his prayer, his conversation with the Father gave him the courage that whatever happened, he could face his mission. He could walk on the waters of whatever the future brought. Storm though it was, he could walk across the sea. And then, even in the midst of that, he thinks of his disciples. He knows they must be afraid in the boat, on the sea, in the storm. And so he doesn't just go across the sea, he goes to them. And he invites them, in the person of Peter, to come across the waters to him as well. And God bless Peter, he jumps out of the boat, and he walks on water for a little while. But, like all of us, he sometimes lets his fear get the better of him. And he doesn't, in the midst of the storm, stay focused on Jesus. He focuses on the fear. And he begins to sink. And Jesus reaches out to him and lifts him up. And he walks on the water again, holding Jesus' hand. And I think that's the grace we all seek. This time in our lives, at all the times in our lives. That we know that God is not only in the still small voice, he's there. He's in our quiet moments of prayer. He's in the miracle of the Mass. He's in his word. But he also wants to be present to us in the midst of our worries, the midst of our fears, the midst of our losses. Jesus doesn't make the storm go away necessarily. It calms, but his purpose isn't to fix the storm. His purpose is to help his disciples pass through it. And the same is true for us. He stands by our side in the midst of everything that the world can bring to us. Doesn't cause the storms or the earthquakes or the epidemics, but he comes to be with us and comfort us and to help us walk on water. And that's probably what trusting in the Lord means, trusting that we can take that step just as Jesus did, as Peter did, and not give in to fears and worries. Admit them and deal with them, but deal with them knowing that the Lord is by our side, present to us in the midst of all of those things.